For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
7:08 on CJAD. Welcome to today's Entrepreneur, presented by Fuller Landau, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. My name is Dan Delmar, along with my co-host, Fuller Landau's Josh Miller. How are you, Josh?
Excellent, Dan.
Great. And today we're talking phones, specifically inbound phone calls. And with us from Image24 is Gary Blair. Gary, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So as usual, Gary, we start by asking our entrepreneurs, what is it exactly that you do? Tell us about Image24.
Well, Image24 started out 43 years ago as a telephone answering service, and over the years has grown into a full call center, so corporate inbound stuff. We answer for just about any type of industry, and we respond to client calls, we respond to inbound emails, and handle them on behalf of our clients when they're not available to do so themselves.
Has this, I guess, product or service evolved over the years? Tell us a little bit about kind of the beginning of Image24 or whatever it was way back when.
Way back when, it was a telephone answering service, and it certainly has evolved tremendously over the years. We used to answer on switchboards that were rented from the phone company that were made by Northern Telecom. And so if you think about Edith Ann and you think about her as a switchboard, that's basically what our operations looked like 43 years ago. They've changed over the years. The equipment is now owned by the firm ourselves, and it's completely computerized. It's the assistance that we have from the technology side of things makes the work of our agents so much more easier nowadays, and allows us to do things that, we couldn't even have imagined when I was a kid out of school and joined the firm.
Did you start this company? Was it a predecessor?
Where
did it begin?
Family business. We started by my grandmother and my dad and my mom at the time. And I joined the firm almost immediately out of school. And as it normally is in family businesses, I worked in the business ever since its inception. So I used to go in and wash floors. I would type invoices because in those days everything was manual. And so I literally grew up in it.
That's interesting because we hear a lot of businesses where the kids come in to the operations, and some of them have their silver spoon and start at the top and kind of get their feet up on the desk and have a big chair. But there are many others that actually the more successful entrepreneurs that we hear about, Dan, really started from the bottom and just learned their way up. Gary, how did you feel that was the right way to go? Did you ever want to maybe work not for your parents and maybe start somewhere else?
I probably had about 17 career choices in mind when I was in school. My dad used to tease me. We used to have Sunday dinner together as a family every weekend. And my dad would say at one point, "So what are you going to be this week?" I have a thirst to learn. I love learning. And so there was so many things that I found interesting. I kind of fell into the family business, I think, at a point in time. My dad was very much a family-oriented man, and he really wanted to bring all of his kids into the business. And so it was comfortable. It was easy. And in as much as starting from the bottom, I literally started from the bottom. And not because I was a kid before I graduated school working in the business. My dad had that philosophy. He felt that if you didn't know the nuts and bolts of a business, that you would never be able to really manage it properly one day.
And was he there to guide you, or did he kind of leave you to your own device and really just learn it on your own?
A little bit of both. He kind of had a balance in that way. He really wanted me to be successful. He wanted my brother to be successful. My brother worked in the business up until last year. He passed away last year. And so he gave us what we needed instructionally and then let us loose.
Now, Dan, we've always talked about father and son, of how management styles can differ greatly. Gary, you and your dad, different management styles? Are we talking opposite extremes, or were you on the same page?
We had very different management styles. We really did. We used to, we clashed on a lot of items. My dad was definitely of a certain generation and a certain mindset, and I tend to think that I was different. I was automatically different because I was a different generation, but then I've always tried to keep very current about that. Our business is all about the people that work in it. And so, trends change in business, the way that you deal on the HR side with folks and whatnot. Certainly the priorities of younger people coming into my company are very different than when I was joining the firm. So we disagreed a lot on that. But the principles of how to run a business organizationally, structurally, those sorts of things, we had a lot of common ground as well.
How did you deal with the disagreements? Was it an outside party? Did, whatever Dad said was because, hey, he controlled effectively?
It was the latter. It was, I had a lot of respect for my father. He did not come from a family that was able to give him a lot of benefits when he was a kid growing up. He basically came from a very poor family, and he left school when he was in grade 8. He made his own life. He was one of those self-made men of a certain generation, and I respected greatly that he, the business that I worked in was something that he started from scratch, not that I did. And I wonder sometimes to myself whether I would be able to have done that or not. Now, I'll never know the answer to that question, but in that light, I've watched a lot of people create business, and it's not an easy thing to do. Otherwise, I guess everybody would be in one or own one. And so at the end of the day, when my dad said, ultimately, it's my decision and this is the route we're going to go, I went along with him.
And the listeners don't know this, but your dad is no longer with you or with the...
No, my dad passed away last year as well.
So there is definitely a transition issue, not just from, I guess, father, son, it's owner, it's partner. There's a lot of issues, and I guess that you had to work out or get to know or take over, with the mutual respect and certainly your team and employees. And when we come back from the break, we'll explore that a little further.
Today's Entrepreneur on CJAD with our guest Gary Blair of Image24.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
7:17 on today's Entrepreneur, inspiring stories from outstanding business people. Dan Delmar and Fuller Landau's Josh Miller with our guest Gary Blair of Image24. And Josh, we're talking about how business can survive when its founder passes away, and certainly when you're passing it on to family, you want to sort of keep the same rhythm, and a lot of challenges, Gary, in that respect. How were you able to keep the same structure that your father put in place, or did it change sort of depending on your management style?
It's in the process of changing right now. As I said, we had some differences in terms of the way that we saw doing business and so forth. And so now that I'm leading the firm, we have created an internal committee within the company to review everything that we do with the intention of making whatever modifications that we see would be beneficial for the business nowadays. It really couldn't possibly be done when my dad was sort of at the top.
Did you have an issue did you find the employees looked at you differently being the son of the owner, or because you had started really from the bottom and you were really rolling up your sleeves and working that did you get respect from them, I guess is my ultimate question.
I think I did. I'd like to believe that I did. I've always felt a need to have a lot of respect in the, to create a professional working environment. I think now so more than ever, that's a necessity if you want to get the respect of your staff. You can't do anything about getting respect except for earn it. That's something that I've always believed. And I can't demand something from my staff that I'm not willing to show first and foremost in terms of any kind of a role model. And so I think that's ultimately important in every business. And certainly, again, and it is in ours because our business is all service, and so it's all about the people themselves.
And I think that leads us certainly to our next topic of human resource. The business is service. Your team is probably your number one asset, maybe your number one expense. How do you find them? How do you deal with them? How do you include them? What's your secret, and what have you learned along the way about what works and what doesn't work with regards to your human resource?
Well, they certainly are the most important thing in the organization, and they are the largest expense. We've been extremely fortunate. Tried to groom from within, number one, whenever it's been possible, and we have a long-standing tenure for a company of our size. The average tenure is actually quite long. Our clients are always very impressed when we come, and we make a point of when I make introductions about telling the clients how long each member of our staff have actually been working for the firm. In service, it's ultimately continuity is so important, and so if you're going to deal with a service-oriented firm, you want to know that people aren't flipping over every 6 months or every year, because just by the time the individual, the staff member gets used to the client and vice versa, you've got somebody to start over from, and you're starting completely from scratch, because a lot of business is about relationship. It's not just about knowledge and that sort of thing. You need to know your clients. You need to understand where they're coming from. They're all individuals. They all have different buttons that, work differently for them and so forth. And so that's really important for us.
How many employees are you, approximately?
46.
Do you do formal evaluations? Do you check your employees? Do you give them reviews on a periodic basis?
On an annual basis. Our center staff, our agents, are actually reviewed on a quarterly basis. All of our admin staff are evaluated on an annual basis, a formal evaluation process.
Has that always taken place, or is this something that's newer?
That's me. Yeah.
One of the changes, I guess.
Well, we've been doing it for longer than just the last year, for sure, but it's something that I had to struggle to put in place. It was something that my dad saw very differently. He was a man who used to say to his bankers, his accountants, and his lawyers that I fly by the seat of my pants, but I know where I'm going, don't worry about me. And that works for some entrepreneurs. It definitely does. I've met a lot of entrepreneurs over the years, and there's a lot of commonalities between them. It doesn't work for most staff members, though. Mm-hmm. Staff members need more concrete. They need to hear more feedback. They need to know where they stand. They need to know if you're happy. They need to know if you're unhappy. They just need to know where they stand.
Do you have different generations in your office?
Yes, we do. We definitely have all three, and that's a challenge unto itself. Our National Trade Association has recognized that fact, actually, and a number of years ago, they started giving a fair number of presentations on exactly the differences between Ys and X's and my generation, which I'm not even sure what we call it. Well, baby boomers, I guess.
And did you develop a different style, or are your evaluations kind of created in such that you're really addressing each generation, or?
Well, trying to. It's a bit of a struggle. It's a hard thing to do, because what I found as a owner-manager all these years is that I try and make allowances for my staff. I know what everybody's weaknesses and strengths are. I know what my own are, and I think it's very I think it's very important to put those on the table so that everybody recognizes what they are. It's the only way that we can address any of them. And it's interesting, because when I've made allowances for certain people's weaknesses, knowing what their strengths were, and that their strengths way outweighed their weaknesses, I found sometimes some staff members who don't get that same allowance tend to take it badly. And it's a challenge. I mean, running a business with staff is, just, human interactions. They're always a challenge.
But being direct and opening their eyes can certainly reap benefits going forward. Now, you mentioned trade association, which I'd really like to go into, because every entrepreneur and businesses have their trade associations. Some they find more important, some they find less important. I'd love to get your thoughts on it after we come back from the break.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
7:25 on today's Entrepreneur. Our guest is Gary Blair of Image24, and we want to talk a bit about trade shows and trade associations and the importance of that. Depends on the profession. Some are, I guess, Josh, more important than others. But for Gary, I think certainly keeping an eye on competitors, keeping an eye on new technologies is pretty beneficial to you.
Yes, it absolutely is. We have a wonderfully active trade association. It represents call centers from right across the country. My dad made it a point of joining the trade association as soon as he started the business, because he just knew from his previous business background that was the place to learn. Just go and speak to the people that were in the business, learn from them, share with them, offer his own, a point of view on things and so forth. Our trade association is kind of unique when I talk to other people, because although we are competitors, when I first joined the business, there was a restriction in terms of who you could take on as a client, and it really was a geographical restriction. So you could only have clients in the proximity of the area that you were actually operating in. And so our trade association was something where we could come together as call centers from across the country and talk very openly, because there was nothing to worry about in terms of competition, that sort of thing. That's changed tremendously over the years. Nowadays, my customers are everywhere on the planet. Principally our clients are Canadian. We have more and more American business all the time, but right across the country. And as a result of that, what's happened over the years is people are a little bit more restrained about the information that they'll gladly share when they come out to the shows and the conferences and that sort of thing. But that still said, the amount of sharing that goes on is quite incredible. When I talk about the very, very competitive nature of other fields, and when I get feedback from those guys about what their associations are all about.
Now, I would imagine that the trade association certainly has many members, and maybe a little less today. I don't know if there are any consolidations, but I presume there's a core group, some guys that you communicate or meet with on a more frequent basis, or you connected with, so you guys feel comfortable sharing that information, less as competitors and more as collaborators.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, because we're located here in Montreal, and this is where our roots are, Our agents, our center is a bilingual center, and I have developed relationships with centers right across the country who are working mostly in their own regional areas. And when they want to do national business in Canada, it's important that they have the French component. They're not able to find French staff in the regions of Canada that they operate out of, and so what they basically do is they hire us for the French side of their business. So if we're able to get the national account ourselves, then we can get the whole pie, and if we can't, we get a piece of it, and we're happy to have either.
And a gentleman's agreement that you try not to step on each other's toes?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you that there's a lot of gentlemen and gentle ladies in this business.
Well, that's certainly an excellent resource to have. I would imagine on a technology standpoint, it also moves so quickly, you must compare what's working, what's not working, and certainly the changes along the way.
That's probably one of the greatest challenges outside the HR side of running a center nowadays. The technology, like I suppose in everybody's field, is changing so rapidly, it's incredible. And it's not just the technology you're using today, but it's what's coming down the pipe in 6 months from now and in a year from now. And so depending upon what you're willing to invest in equipment, time, training, et cetera, is it still going to be relevant in a year from now is the question that you have to ask yourself all the time.
And I think technology is a huge aspect that we're going to explore a little further right after the break, but certainly also rebranding, because Dan, Image24 wasn't always Image24. If anybody recalls the name Telepage, well, that's something that the company used to be called, and still called maybe to the familiar people today, but we'll talk about the whole rebranding and that experience from Gary when we come back.
All right, Gary Blair of Image24, our guest on today's Entrepreneurs.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Coming up to 7:35, welcome back to today's Entrepreneur, presented by Fuller Landau, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. My name is Dan Delmar, along with Josh Miller of Fuller Landau, and our guest is Gary Blair of Image24, an inbound call center. And we're talking with Gary about some of the challenges facing the industry, keeping up with technology, having the right people, Josh, and having the right organizational structure. And certainly in terms of people, it's we were mentioning to Gary, it's kind of interesting to have this business in Montreal where you have bilingual staff. How do you go about recruiting that staff, and do you have a process that I guess to weed people out, because it's a profession that requires a certain skill set?
It certainly does. And we've been working on that process and perfecting it probably for about 25 years, and gotten pretty good with it over the years. We
at
started,
least with one or two of the generations.
yeah, we started. Recruitment is the number one most important thing for us in our business, because it takes a long time to train an agent. We have over 600 clients, and so for us to get an agent fully trained to be able to respond to any of those clients' calls, it takes about 6 months. And so you want to make sure that you find the right candidate that's going to be in the chair for a couple of years with you, if not longer. Agents do have a shelf life. It's generally a job which is considered to be a level entry job, and so we do know that our agents are likely, the really smart ones are likely to move on past us. We want to know that we have a lifespan of at least 3 years and hopefully 5 years, and we do have some career people that have been with us for 15, 20, 25 years. We have one agent is going to be celebrating 35 years with us this month, in fact. And so we spend a lot of time on the recruitment process, and we moved to something which is called group interviewing last year. And what we do is we involve level deep into our organization when we're looking for candidates, and we bring them in a group. So we will set up a group interview with about 6 or 7 or maybe up to 8 candidates maximum. We tell them that it's a group interview. And basically the questions that are asked in that are non-direct. They're not the type of questions that you might normally ask in a one-on-one interview. We give them a brief explanation about what the job is, and then we try and draw out of them what their character is, because character is really what we're looking for. And we've developed questions around that help very much. We want to find the stars. We want to find those rough diamonds. And one of the questions at the end of the interview is, if you were the person hiring right now, which of the people sitting around the table would you hire?
That's a tough question.
It's a tough question, and the answers are really interesting sometimes.
Do they
You can get thrown.
I would imagine that memory has got to be an important factor, but maybe less so today with the technology. How has that technology change affected the people that you recruit?
Excellent question. It's changed dramatically over the years. In the olden days, when we were when we were on some of the previous operating equipment that we had, it really boiled down to how good an agent's memory was, because you could have reams of information on one client and what to do in different scenarios, and what to say and how to proceed and so forth. And so rather than just have a lot of dead air when an agent was sort of researching something and looking through just one big long script, no matter how easy you tried to make it, it was hard. It was a much harder profession than it is nowadays. We replaced our switch equipment 5 years ago. We bought state of the art. It is an incredible system, and everything now is very heavy on the programming side and much more easier on the operating side. So the mantra in our organization has now become that the easiest job in the company must be the frontline people's job. And so the system, the accounts are all scripted depending upon what a caller is going to respond in terms of a particular question an agent asks. Might bring an agent into an entirely different script. So if the client says yes, you're going to go into a yes script. In other words, once the agent presses on yes, it automatically populates the next question that's coming up, where they go.
So the trick is not to make it sound canned when they're talking on the phone?
Right. And that's the art that we have to teach them now. We have color coding in the system for different things. A green code with script in it means you must read this verbatim word for word, because it's legally required by the client, or it's ultra important that the agent says it word for word. Other than that, we train agents to follow the script but to personalize it. And everybody has an individual character. You discover that early in the training process, and that's what you nurture and you bring out in them.
I was going to say, Gary seems to have a very soothing voice. Is that something that you encourage? I mean, does it get that minute when you talk about the details?
Well, my dad worked in radio, actually, ironically enough, many, many years ago. And he used to drag me when I was a little kid down to actually CJAD studio. He worked for Standard. And he taught my brother and my sister and I how to answer the phone when we were old enough to actually pick up the receiver. We were taught that the phone, the handset of the telephone was actually a microphone. And so he taught us distance to, speak into it, how to speak, how to enunciate, those sorts of things. So he never did radio. He never did actually broadcast himself. He was always working behind the scenes, but definitely knew the art of how to speak and how to enunciate and that sort of thing, and taught all three of us.
We'll get to the rebranding in just a second, but my one question before that is the advancement in technology. Did that help you sell better to customers because it was easier for them to understand and get the benefits?
Absolutely. I don't think unless we had changed our technology, we'd probably still be in business right now. It's the world is so much more demanding. The actual origins of the company in the telephone answering industry was to take simple telephone messages. It was to take a name and a phone number, and we don't do any of that anymore. That just doesn't exist out there in the real world. Technology has replaced that many, many moons ago, and so our client applications nowadays are more about disseminating information, gathering information, walking people through websites, things that we just never even dreamed of doing many, many years ago.
Now let's come to rebranding. In the next few minutes, your name today is Image24. Your name prior was Telepage. What was the process? What were the thoughts behind the entire rebranding?
Well, the one thing that we didn't touch on today is that Telepage and Image24 still to this day is both a call center as well as a radio paging or a beeper business company. And that was very much a part of who we were for many, many years. We started in the call center business. When my dad jumped into this, he recognized early on that many, many of our customers, let's say upwards of 60 to 70%, if not greater, were actual users of pagers as well. Because in those days, cell phones didn't exist, faxes didn't exist. I mean, so much of what we take for granted nowadays didn't exist. He saw an opportunity. There were very few players in the market at the time. He took a lot of money and went to an engineering firm and said, I want to put myself up a paging network, and did, and we ran it, and we still run it today. It's a product which is in decline, obviously. It is being replaced daily by lots of other different technologies and so forth. So at the time that it was a really hot item and we were getting into it, we wanted to create a name that really identified both of our product lines. So Tele representing the telephone answering service and Page representing the paging business. We did a study not that long ago where we determined that less than 10% of our clients are now users of both products. And so we thought it was time for us to really re-identify our call center side of things.
Is this something that you outsourced? Did you realize it internally? Did you Was any part of your team or your staff involved in any of this?
Most definitely. It was kind of a consensus that we had come to internally, and we brought in a marketing firm from the outside world, and they've helped us, held our hands right through the whole process, and helped us develop the name that we have today, Image24.
Were you on board? How much of this was driven by you?
Oh, in terms of if it was a difference between how my dad and I saw this?
Exactly.
Yeah, it was 100% on my side. Yeah.
Did you start this, forgive me for asking, but did you start this process before your dad passed away?
Oh, yes. He was an integral part of the process. And actually, I think once it started, he was really on board and really enjoyed the process. And we, both him and I, unanimously agreed on the name. We had several to select from, and we really hashed them out. And at the end of the day, we both picked the same name. So no disagreement on that side.
And the forms of media that you're deciding to use that might best suit the way to get the name, the rebranding out there. How were those choices made, and what are you using that works?
Basically, we don't have a large marketing budget. The margins in our firm are it's a business, but we don't have a large marketing budget per se. So we are doing it a lot just by virtual presence on the internet. Most clients, I would say that probably 70% of our business comes from client referrals and people who will find us. Traditionally, they used to find us in the yellow pages when there were paper directories, which I think everybody knows that's pretty much dead. Internet is the way to go, and so that's where we've spent the lion's share of our marketing dollars.
And is this something you're constantly doing internally, or are any internal people driving that, call it social media or internet, or are you still outsourcing it?
We've outsourced that, yeah. We're an outsourcer, and so we appreciate that outsourcers do the job better than anybody internally in most instances, and so we decided to outsource that.
Advisors, using outside advisors when you know you don't have it inside. It's certainly a great lesson to be learned. Know what you can do, know what you can't, and then go from there.
Gary Blair of Image24, our guest on today's Entrepreneur, and after the break, Josh will bring in Kevin Ammerman to talk some IT issues.
And I think we'll talk about some challenges in bringing out new product and new software and things to look out for and things to plan for.
All right, that's coming up next on today's Entrepreneur.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
747 on CJAD 800. Today's Entrepreneur, presented by Fuller Landau, inspiring stories from outstanding business people. Dan Delmar and Fuller Landau's Josh Miller with you. Our guests, Gary Blair of Image24, and also we welcome Kevin Ammerman back to the program, IT specialist at Fuller Landau. How are you, Kevin?
Fine, thanks.
Good. Now, in a business like Gary's, of course, software and computers and all this technology becomes very, very important, and upgrading it becomes also important. And why don't we start by sharing your story, Josh? You had a recent hardware upgrade issue, let's just say, from a certain telephone manufacturer from Waterloo that will remain unnamed. So how did you guys deal with that? And when you have a brand new piece of machinery that you rely heavily on suddenly conks out, you got to have a backup plan, right?
You got to have plans A, B, and C, because whenever you bring anything new into the office, you got to count on things going wrong. You got to have somebody. You got to rely on your early adopters and their good nature.
Or guinea pigs, by the way, for that matter.
Guinea pig, sacrificial lamb, something along those lines. And you got to really rely on their good nature and their ability to roll with the punches, because things will go wrong. There's going to be changes, and you got to make sure that while you're doing your best to bring these new and fun and hopefully very productivity-enhancing gadgets into the office, you have to have you got to make sure that they don't disrupt the office as well.
Gary, what's your philosophy on new technology? Would you consider yourself an early adopter, or do you sort of take a more wait-and-see approach?
A bit of both, yeah. I stay on top of technology, so I know what's coming down the pipeline, and especially in particular in our industry. We're not a beta test site. We could be if we wanted to be, but I really don't want to do that to my clients. So when you were really customer service oriented in that regard, I'll take a second spot in terms of making sure that it's going to be solid. And
me being this guinea pig or sacrificial lamb, as Kevin put it, with this new smartphone product, I'm a gadget guy, and I love the early adopter and try and test things out. But I think what's important is, and Kevin can elaborate, is the backup plan, is the testing it before and making sure things happen. So perhaps, Kevin, you can elaborate a little bit on areas or ways that businesses or entrepreneurs should ensure things are tested out or have backups in case things go awry.
Well, sometimes what we see is an office will be sold on a new product or technology, and they'll roll it out overnight and make sure that that initial transition is as easy as possible for their staff. And if everything goes well, then that's fantastic. But all too often, things will go a little bit sideways, and it's how quickly they can react and get their people back in contact with their clients, as it may be, or whatever the nature of their business is. That's really what sort of tells the tale about how things are going to go, because there's always problems. You got to count on those things going wrong.
And if it's new technology or new software, how do you find the specialists of the service providers that have come out with it? Do you find them helpful, or you got to kind of rely on your own devices?
We really see that it's a learning process on both ends. So as we call for help and try to escalate things, we find that the frontline support is basically non-existent. You really are on your own when you're playing with these new devices. As you get higher up the food chain in terms of support, you get a little bit more depth to the knowledge, but they are experiencing new circumstances all the time as well. So it does become a bit of a problem, and you got to be prepared as a business to work with those providers and allow them to have some time to learn how these things work too.
Hardware, software, is there a difference between the two? When
They're
you're bringing out new product or new service?
they're really, really tightly tied together. So it's rare that you'll get new hardware that doesn't come with new software. We're seeing in your specific case that it was a really big pill to swallow all at once. So the new hardware did come with new server software to back it up, and that's where things get a little bit more fun. There's a lot more potential for disruption there, and it takes a lot longer to set things up and make sure things are working properly.
What about testing it? Is it easy to test stuff, whether offline, or do you have to have separate servers or separate systems? How does that kind of work in the background?
From the technology end, you got to have redundant testing systems and things like that. These days, it's relatively easy to set those things up because a lot of our servers are virtualized, and it's pretty straightforward to set up a test environment. But the problem is getting the people to test it and making sure that, again, they stay productive during that testing phase, and that you don't exhaust their goodwill during the process.
When you're going through one of these processes to update or to upgrade, you got to do the backup stuff, right? Do most companies these days do that on the cloud, so to speak, on an online server, or do they need a physical hard drive or something to back up their material?
Well, there's always a combination, and these days it's getting easier and easier to rely on the cloud. As we give people new phones and new devices, they find that they just turn them on, log in, and all of their settings and favorites sort of magically appear. But what happens is people tend to rely on that a little bit too much, and that's where you got to rely on your IT staff and the people sort of behind the scenes to make sure that provisioning service is backed up somehow. And this is what's really dangerous, especially when you're moving between technologies, is there can be gaps in those backups. So you got to make sure that that's all covered and take a step back and look at the big picture.
And I think that the difference and the combination and the distinguishing between work information and personal information on your work devices is important. When we come back, we'll kind of talk a little bit about that with Kevin and the challenges for entrepreneurs.
And I believe, Josh, your new old phone had this little separator for work and play, right?
Exactly.
How's that working out for you?
At the moment, I don't have that old phone,
It's a
so
little
hey.
unbalanced.
Our guest on today's entrepreneur, Gary Blair of Image24, and Kevin Ammerman, IT specialist at Fuller Landau. We're talking about upgrading your technology. More on that after the break at 7:53.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
7:55 on CJAD 800. Our guests tonight, Gary Blair of Image24 and Kevin Ammerman, IT specialist at Fuller Landau. And I'm talking about upgrading, Kevin, these new technologies, whether it's cell phones or computers. And one recurring theme is this balance between your work life and your personal life, because many people have cell phones, laptops that have both of those elements in that. When you're buying this new hardware, do you have to, as a company, how do you get across those challenges? Do you have to set aside certain rules saying, certain things can't be found on certain devices, for example?
Yeah, we try to make really clear to our staff that they are owned by the office and that they're to be used for work purposes, and we own all the content and all this kind of thing. But there's a lot of pressure these days. It's called Bring Your Own Device, BYOD, for people to bring in their own phones, their own tablets and things like this, and try to connect them to our work services. So we're trying to find ways to do this and to allow people to use their fancy toys and tools, because they are very helpful in terms of productivity. If people find that they're easier to use, then they're standard computers and laptops, then more power to them. But we got to have a way to control that and make sure that we keep things secure and that we don't bring in viruses or that we don't allow our proprietary or confidential information to get out to people.
How often would you check some of the hardware devices? Is there something that you should have a standard procedure in kind of checking them periodically, or is it something automated in the background that's always happening?
We pretty tightly control what can connect to our network. So that's a good way to maintain sort of a first line of defense, is to make sure that people really can't connect with anything that isn't approved. And then beyond that, you've got to make sure that you're running, virus scanners and security scanners and keeping an eye and logging the traffic that's going through these devices.
Communicating a plan, how formal should it be before you roll anything out?
It's essential, not only in terms of rollout, but in terms of the expectations of the users. So we have it built right into our policy manual, sort of the way that we expect the equipment to be used. And then we try to live up to that in terms of providing these new tools and toys and better ways to help make it easier for our staff to live up to what the policy manual sort of expects of them.
So plug and play isn't necessarily so plug and play.
No, rarely so. In fact, it's pretty rare that you can just walk in and plug something in and away it goes. There's actually a lot of behind the scenes work going on to make that happen.
And I think that's the lesson. Plug and play isn't so plug and play, and you better test and plan and make sure when you roll it out, people understand that it might take some time. Thanks very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
And as we approach the end of our show, as we usually do, Dan, we turn to our friendly entrepreneur that's sitting right next to us and say, Gary, what one piece of advice would you give to today's entrepreneur?
I think the advice that I would give was advice that I received many years ago. I was very fortunate in my business career. I had a lot of mentors who helped me along the way, gave me a lot of good food for thought. And one that stuck with me most of my life was a gentleman who said to me when I was a young guy, don't work in your business, work on your business. In other words, stay away from micromanaging, because unless you're willing to develop people and unless you're willing to put a certain amount of liberty into their hands to help you build your business and let them run with what they do best, you're going to be running in circles. You'll never grow your business. And nowadays, that's so much more important than it ever was before, because as I alluded to before, we need to be on top of so many things. Technology is just one of them, but it is such an important one in our industry. And if we're not looking 12 months down the road, then we're not looking anywhere.
And Dan, my takeaway, and just 2 points, just to build on that, is it's easy to get lost in the details. Entrepreneurs, you can really get lost. You can kind of delve into something just to try and make sure that one little bit is working properly. But if you do that and you ignore, as Gary said, you ignore the balance of the business and you're not working on it, you're not always taking that look from 35,000 feet to make sure it's going in the right direction, then you can certainly lose out on things. And I would say my second point, and one of my takeaways that Gary alluded to earlier, is listen. Be open-minded and listen to others. People have a lot of input to give, a lot of valuable input to give. And if you can absorb that and apply it properly, a successful entrepreneur you will certainly be.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks Gary Blair of Image24 and Kevin Ammerman, IT specialist at Fuller Landau, for joining us tonight. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Today's Entrepreneur on CJAD 800, back next Monday night at 7 p.m. Have a good night.